All right. Well, we are back here on the One Leg Up Network. It's July 2nd. It's one of the most important days in American history. And actually, John Adams himself wrote it'd be the most memorable day in the history of the United States of America, July the 2nd. And of course, with me again on July the 2nd is one Richard Howell. You've known him from other podcasts we've done and from the interaction we have on social media. Richard, it's so great to have you on the day we approved the Declaration of Independence 249 years later.
Great to be back. It's great to be back. Well, today's the day they approved the resolution, which is why we celebrate the 4th. And Adams did celebrate the 4th after himself. So he was pretty clear on what day that we probably wanted to celebrate. But there were reasons why he said what he said about the 2nd, which I think is important to talk about.
So let's dive into it because obviously you are a big historian. You've done reenactments about the American Revolution War. But I do feel like July 2nd is worth noting because not many do.
No, I think you're right. I think it is worth noting. And it's with me and doing all the research I've done over the last several decades, it's there are a lot of dates that we should note that we don't. And obviously, this is a good one because you're 2 days ahead of the Declaration of Independence, and also too, it celebrates the passing of the Lee Resolution or the Virginia Resolution. That was at the heart of the Declaration. Very much a story, and it proves and it demonstrates that the Declaration itself was a massive undertaking, a seminal work that took months to put together.
And you would say blood, sweat, and tears went into this resolution because they literally fought to be free.
Right.
And so
Right.
when you say months and months, are we talking 1775 way back when, or even before that?
Well, in different senses, way before. In other senses, throughout the war itself. The one I was referring to more immediately was the Declaration itself, or the move to independence, which was not decided within a couple of days. It was over, as you understand. I mean, it was over a number of months when people were getting to that realization. It was in the backs of their minds before, but initially, early on, it wasn't seen as a move that had to be taken at that point. And so,
well, Adams
as
writes it took it was about a 7 month thought process or 6 months. He wrote in his letter to Abigail, if this was done months ago. So obviously this was on the back of his mind as well.
Oh, it was. Yeah. And understand in the case of both Adams and both Lees, the war had raged, particularly in Massachusetts, but Virginia too had its share of fighting, and it would have a lot more later on. So it was a culmination not just of the culture in New England and in Massachusetts, but what physically was happening up there.
And for full disclosure, you're coming to us from Massachusetts, aren't you? Raised up there?
I am. But when I speak, I don't speak. Some people do, by the way. I mean, that's fine if that's their perspective. But I mean, to me, it's important to speak more from an ecumenical standpoint. I happen to live here, but I could certainly give you the history of Pennsylvania and Virginia and South Carolina as I can with Massachusetts. And it's important because Patrick Henry's seminal speech at St. John's Church in March of 1775, late March 1775, where he's talking about armies already on the march, was not only prolific, it was highly accurate. And he would have known because he was corresponding with the men from Massachusetts. They were all on the committees of correspondence, most of them, I should say, were. And I mean, we're talking within 2 weeks of Lexington and Concord. We're talking a month after the Salem incident. It just happens to be they started in Massachusetts, but there was a reason why. And but as soon as the fighting started, particularly after the last seminal event that we had on June 14th of the 250th anniversary of the establishment of the Army, in October 15th, when we're going to have the establishment of the U.S. Navy, those events in and out of themselves are not moves to independence, because there have been civil wars in the English speaking realm for hundreds of years over these issues. And this was just the latest in a series of them. But, well, probably the biggest of them. But I mean, certainly, um, you know, it did not necessarily mean independence at that time, but it was starting to dawn on people. And the reason it was, it's very simple. There was no redress, certainly to the crown. Forget it. They had the olive branch petition that went out to him. Soon after Lexington had conquered, he ignored it. You also had no redress with Parliament because the Tories, and through George III, and we talked about how that happened, controlled Parliament. Now they were going to lose control of it in late 1781, early 1782, which is why the war ends, part of it. And of course, the Supreme Court, their high court, just recently separated a few years ago, was part of the House of Lords. So the Chief Justice was a Tory. So there was no recourse. There was literally nobody to appeal to there. And that's why you see the break after, a year and 3 months of warfare almost. That's when you see this break happening.
And this break meaning we break away from
we declare independence.
Right. Now, we didn't even catch up with you in April when you were part of the historic reenactment of the Paul Revere ride. But let's talk about that for a minute, because obviously we're not at America 250 yet. We're getting there, but that ride sort of is a kickoff to all of this, isn't it?
Very many ways. And Paul Revere himself, because he developed an alarm system. I think we talked about this once before too. He had developed an alarm system in 1774 that didn't just spread through New England, but working with, again, other committees of correspondence, which were the members of the legislature, the leading provincial statesmen of the time getting together and determining the course of action to protect themselves, because it wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when hostilities were to break out. And so when his riders would go down, they would meet up with other riders who knew them, and they would spread the word all the way to Georgia. And that happened. And it happened on April 19th. I mean, it took a few days, obviously, at that time to get farther down, but it does get down there.
What was your role with the reenactment? What was your role?
Oh, well, they did two parts of the Paul Revere ride because, it's quite lengthy. And so they did the part in Boston where he crosses over into Charlestown. That was another friend of mine who did that. And that part of it ended in Charlestown and then in Cambridge, where he rides out, right next door. I'm sorry, Somerville, which used to be part of Charlestown. So my part was with our fellow Lexington Minutemen. We recreate the ride from the center of Lexington to the Hancock Clark House, which is only a few blocks away. And that is where he actually warns Adams and Hancock about what is happening. He goes to, at that point, which is the home of Jonas Clark, famous Black Robe Regiment gentleman, and very influential in the town of Lexington, and married to Hancock's cousin, because their grandfather had been the first minister there. Now, Clark never met him because he died 2 years before Clark takes over his parsonage, but very, very interesting. So we recreate that history there.
I would say Revere, and then John Adams. People kind of know of him with Massachusetts, but it's worth reiterating. He's also. Would you say he's one of the proud sons of Massachusetts? Is he glorified up there, or what is?
Yes.
How does Massachusetts feel about him today?
I think it's funny because over the years and the decades, the focus had been taken away from the founders and taken to more contemporary people, and that's shifted back again. So Adams, I mean, I'm going to say we kind of hit bottom at the bicentennial when it came to misinterpreting the American Revolution. In other words, what I call the Deconstructionist era, which was roughly 75 years before that. Around 1900, you start to see, hey, this Constitution is really not that great, and these founders really weren't, and it got worse and worse as that era progressed. Well, I'm going to say Adams had quite a renaissance, obviously with the bicentennial. People up until that point had only, known him as the guy that succeeded George Washington as the president. But then all of a sudden, the stories were coming out that he was the man responsible ultimately for nominating, at first openly and then secondly behind the scenes, Washington's appointment as commander in chief of the army
Hmm.
for the June 15th day. Um, the other thing is his role in the Declaration of Independence. People were starting to remember that Jefferson had written it because that had been forgotten a little bit too, but he had written it. But Adams was the vocal progenitor for it on the floor of the Congress. And Jefferson gave him credit for that. He said he was the one that shepherded it through with his voice. Adams gave Jefferson the credit, saying he's the one that put it together with his pen. Each
Right.
man really complimented the other.
Now, speaking of Jefferson, have you ever been to the Jefferson House? Do they do any events at the Jefferson House that you know of
I
in Philly?
have. I have. Ironically, the last one I did, it's a little off topic. It was to celebrate Lafayette's final visit to America. And both Jefferson and Adams were alive at that time. And I took part in a reenactment, not just at Monticello, but at the University of Virginia, where we recreated a dinner that was held in that very room. Um, and just a couple of months prior, we recreated it at the Adams homestead as well when he went to visit there.
Oh, cool. Well, this is the thing about you and the reenactment is that the founding of the military 250 years ago made all of this possible for you. So I'm
Yeah.
sure you not only are proud of our military, you're kind of there's sort of a gratitude for it because hey, it's given you your line of work because you deal with the muskets, you deal with all the armaments, right?
Yes. Oh, sure. And I've certainly learned a whole new dimension, since getting into that. I was blessed enough to start with a horse dragoon unit for 10 years, and then an artillery unit for 5 years, and then got into the Lexington Minutemen, as basically an infantry unit, for lack of a better term, um, which it is. So I did learn, all those aspects of the fighting. I land at least.
That's so interesting, and I've yet to do see one of those reenactments. I gotta catch it one of these years. It just seems very interesting. And we've talked about it before, but you've done Gettysburg, you've done all the different circuits, right?
I did Gettysburg as a passive one. I was dressed, but I have never. I've been asked to, but I've never actually fielded in Civil War. Although I have Civil War uniforms too.
Wow. What are you wearing right now as we talk to you, by the way?
Well, what I have on, um, we call these small clothes, and small clothes happen to be the vest or the waistcoat and the breeches and the shirt, and I have a neck stock on, and I have a frilly shirt on. I For the podcast, I figured I'd wear my
Love it.
finery. Um, and so these are actually a uniform piece for a continental officer. I have a major general regimental coat upstairs that
Mm.
matches this. It's just so hot today, I didn't have it on, but
I've
that's
asked
what I am
others.
wearing.
I asked one of my earlier guests today, Richard Battle, about this. I feel like generals back in the day are so much more revered. I mean, obviously Washington's revered, and then the list goes from then on. Why aren't today's generals that continue to, you know, keep the military going, keep leading the military revered as much?
Because so much had changed in how the government worked, how it was seen. Um, we have far more generals today than we've ever had in our history, meaning that a lot of them were made generals for political reasons. So when we've had recent year combats, obviously some exceptions. I think we're getting back to that now.
Hmm.
But with about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly, these were not the battlefield commanders of yore, and you really didn't see that very much after the Civil War. Obviously, with war becoming far more mechanized over the years, but it was a different kind of man. It was there as well, not just
Mm-hmm.
the technology. That's why. Also, too.
Also, today's generals feel a little more political, if I can say that,
Well,
right?
yeah, yeah, they're not always tried and proven, so it's different. These men literally died for the country. Some of these men, I'll stop there, but it's not quite the same. And so it wasn't. I think again, it's changing now, but I will say this much. At the time, with the Declaration and why people fought, oh, these men fought for no money. What a travesty. They weren't paid. They didn't do it for money. they did it to maintain their livelihoods and their lives.
Mm-hmm.
There were times when they needed to break away because their farms and their livelihoods and their families were literally falling apart, and they would go back. But many of them would stay as well, and the families would heave too. So they did as best as they could, and it wasn't just on the more humble end of the spectrum. Um, the Adams and the Jeffersons went through it too,
Mm.
and they had a lot where they had to literally the women had to keep those families together, especially not just their husbands going off, but their sons were starting to go off too.
Sure.
And so, you had that. And of course, not only were they watching their husbands and their sons go off, their brothers, their nephews, their fathers in some cases.
Mm.
And if the lady was older, she would see a couple of three generations going out. Um, and many
Well, it's
times,
amazing. We in New York have the Sons of the American Revolution, and they kind of highlight all of that as well. Have you been connected with them at all, or
oh, yes. Yes. I work with different SAR groups over the years, different
that's so
events and
cool?
such. And DAR events, obviously. SARs are becoming more active over the years. Used to be the DARs did most everything. But
Daughters of
the
America.
SARs, what the SARs are able to do a little bit more is they were able to recreate because they are men, the uniform for, membership.
Mhm.
The females are somewhat limited there because in continental units, you did have some uniform pieces for women,
Mm.
distaff. That was not uncommon in European armies either. So kind of where that came from. But usually they would dress up in the period clothing for the women, like you would see at the Betsy Ross house.
You were also part of the very first inkling of a revolution, which was to me the Boston Tea Party. I mean, when they dumped the tea in the river, that kind of was the spark that ignited this all, right?
Oh yeah, well, it was part of it. It was a culmination, and it was funny because I had done another segment earlier, and one of the things I had talked about leading up to the Declaration, what about this taxing situation?
Mhm.
What about this tea situation? And, for years and years after that generation passed and things got watered down a bit, the Victorian era, later Victorian era, tried to resurrect it, and they didn't have everything quite there. So the deconstructionists were able to come in and knock the legs out from under them, but they created more myths that were worse.
Mm.
The reason that tea got dumped was one, those ships that had come over were American ships. They were not owned by English or English Whigs or even English Tories. They were owned by, and there's a difference.
Mm.
They were owned by the Americans. And in every case save one, that tea was brought aboard without their knowledge or their permission.
Mm.
And
Wow.
by the time they had sailed, they discovered this was in their hold. And the reason they didn't want it was because they knew one, there was a lot of controversy with it. They didn't want to destroy the other trade they had because they had valuable goods that people needed, not just in Boston, but in other towns, because some of those ships are going to other towns where they receive similar treatment.
Sure.
Um, they themselves did not want to be forced under. That tax that was put on the tea was put on there so the king would be able to pay off administrators in the colonies that were henceforth paid by the colonies themselves. So once you did that, guess who they were going to be? Well, he first of all would put his own men in there, and then he'd be able to pay them out of the money he was raising here. And they said, this isn't even done through our legislators. This is completely illegal by English constitutional law, which they had.
By the way, it sounds like the "not in my backyard" has been a thing that's not just a modern day theme. It's dated back 249 plus years. I mean, even the colonialists and those who fought for the revolution did not want the government in their hair at all.
No, and it happened in England. It happened in the English Civil War. It happened in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And those are events that were very much in these men's minds. And it was in England too, by the way. And there's a reason why things exploded here and not there, because they could have easily exploded there as well. But George III was trying to play it smarter. Um, but that's why they dumped the tea in the harbor. Now, what they were trying to do was sail back out. But another story that's not well known is the British Admiral Molyneux threatened to blow those ships out of the water and sink them if they tried to get away. So that's when the owners came in with the Sons of Liberty, and they said, look, we'll give you the keys. You get on the ship, make sure that we don't have trouble with the customs people don't interfere with us, in which they promised that was going to happen. So they helped each other, and their crews and those captains took part in it. The only ship that was an exception to, one of the ship's captains was a Tory, and he he allowed the tea to come on, but he was the only official, but he was the captain, so he could do it. He was the only one, and his owner really was very angry with him that this had happened, and his crew turned around and helped dump some of the tea overboard. So he was a man of one, but he was the only one that had a claim to, yeah, I kind of knew it was there. And so it was a very, very pernicious operation on the other end.
Richard, I got to ask you this. We're talking with Rich Howell, and always glad to have you on my podcast. And it's amazing how a simple FATA meeting on July 4th, 2022 has led to us having a friendship now, right? It's awesome how that's worked out. But Richard, I got to say this. You've been doing these reenactments and all that. Are you still in awe that these gentlemen just use muskets? We have tanks now. They had muskets to deal with and operate. And yet they were effectively able to, defeat the British. Does that still stick in the back of your mind? Like, wow, that is amazing when you think about the mechanisms they had compared to today.
Yeah. Well, it's studying warfare back to antiquity. It's not always the armament, it's the men and how they're led, and the conditions at home that lead to the success and failure of these armies. I mean, it wasn't like anybody had a technical advantage over anybody else. It's a little bit more like that today. But then, obviously, because of the status that the UK had at that point, they certainly did have the weapons, but their Navy, they neglected it terribly. The Army, to a degree, have been neglected terribly. Understand, when the war starts, your average American militiaman had more battlefield experience than your average redcoat in the ranks, or your young officers in the ranks. Now that changes after they leave or taken out of Boston. After they're thrown out of Boston, Washington drives Howe out of Boston with Henry Knox's cannons, which we're going to be celebrating at the end of the year. The Knox Trail from Ticonderoga, another great story. The British Army now is not only equipped and supplied to a degree, now they're battle hardened. That's when they turn into the formidable force that becomes extremely difficult to defeat. And unfortunately for New Yorkers, they have to bear the brunt of this initially. They do quite well, but still, they never really leave the confines of New York City. They really can't get out of there, but they do raids. They never left really the city of Boston except on one time when the shooting started. It almost happened twice, but they never were able really to leave the city confines of Boston, except to that one foray in a Bunker Hill in Charlestown, which they had previously and gave it up. So understand that the American colonies were a component part of the British Empire in ways that were unparalleled in history. It hasn't been repeated. The settlements, the fact that you had a duplicate parallel society really developing here. Obviously developed a little differently for the logistical reasons and cultural reasons, but it developed. And you never really quite saw the equal of that, even with the larger land empires at the time, because France and Spain had larger land empires at that time. You never saw it with the Russian empires or, later empires, which were pretty much dealing with, different circumstances. Their native-born, colonial populations were much smaller, and so much different. So these men fought in the wars before. Some of them were in the British Army and or should we say the English Army and English Navy. So they weren't completely, naive when it came to the ways of warfare. Many of them knew exactly what to do, which is why we were able to pull off what we did.
In amazing fashion. Well, I got to say this because days like July 2nd and of course July the 4th and all the history around the Founding Fathers, you would also agree that inspired the veterans and the soldiers that fought in World War I and World War II, and now that inspiration has trickled into those that fight today. I mean, the founding fathers were our original veterans and soldiers, but
Oh
we
yeah,
never characterize them that way, do we?
they were definitely the example, Alex, until 1950. When the Korean War hit and in Vietnam after that, I'm sure the military talked about them, but the political types did not. And the bicentennial hits in 75, 2 years after our involvement in Vietnam ends, much different because now all of a sudden it starts coming back again, slowly but surely coming back to the point where today you saw the Army parade. Who did they lead off with? The old guard.
Sure.
And that was the
Did that
beginning of the
parade
story.
excite? Did that parade like make you feel any way, like emotional, or how did that watching that make you feel?
Well, it's funny because I've seen the old guard at some of our events. They will show up at our events. They're down in Williamsburg quite a bit because they're in the vicinity, or kind of in the vicinity. But it's good to see that. It's sort of a carryover from that old time. They kept that tradition going, and part of their mission, part of their duty, is to promote that part of the early history of the Army.
Now, before we go into July 4th, because I want to air that part on Friday, by the way, our discussion on July 4th. I know there's always a parade, I guess, in Philly on July 2nd. Is that accurate?
In where?
In Philly, I believe they still do a parade for July 2nd. I believe they
Do they?
commemorate it.
Yeah, it's funny. All the times I've been down there, I should have remembered that. I think it's accurate. I mean, it's funny. One of the questions I've been asked recently was, well, when did this? It may have been you and I talking. When did this, July 4th thing really take hold? The first parade that still in continuous use today is in Rhode Island, Bristol. They started in 1785. So July 4th wasn't anything that came about later on. The controversy, so-called, to the degree it was, and it wasn't much of one then as it is become later with some people, um, was later on. July 4th became the immediate time to celebrate. That's when people would celebrate. Every year after that, they would celebrate July 4th. 1777, they celebrated July 4th. They didn't celebrate the 2nd as the day.
Because that's when it was signed. I mean, it was officially signed on July 4th.
It was signed. It's like today, today, like then, when you pass a bill, you pass a law, it's not law until the president signs it.
Right. And what's funny about that is he wants to sign this big, beautiful bill on July 4th or around it. So talk about keeping in history.
Yes. Wouldn't that be something, right? And, taking a look at that, don't forget, they passed a resolution on July 2nd, but they still have 2 days to go through a document that they have been going through for the previous 6 weeks. And they have
And they
more
were
to
still
do in those
amending it,
2
I believe.
days.
You might have mentioned they were still changing it a little bit leading up to July 4th, right?
Yeah, well, to July 4th, between the 2nd and the 4th, not that it's passed, because it hadn't passed yet. They figured it might. They figured it would. But now because this is it, they have to get it down to where, okay, this is the declaration. We've passed it. We're going to do this. This is what's going to be the day. This is when it becomes official. This is when we do it.
Rich, I can't imagine being that debate of Independence Hall. It seems like there was a bunch of shouting and all that. Maybe I'm misconstruing, but it feels like there was just a bunch of chaos leading up to all of this. What was the most serious debate that they had, and then maybe the funniest debate that they had going about all this?
I would say the more solemn debate is on itself. The actual break for certain, but what direction they were going in. And it was a move that they knew they had to make. It wasn't one that they've been beating the drums about literally for years and years. Oh yeah, we finally getting our. It was a very serious moment for them. It was a very, very, as I said, solemn moment. A moment of great gravity. And the debate didn't come down to, gee, are we doing the right thing by fighting? Everybody agreed that was the right thing to do. I'll use John Dickinson as an example. John Dickinson was one of the leading voices to oppose all of these measures coming out of Great Britain. I mean, resist them with every ounce you had. He was not an advocate for independence at this time, but he wasn't against it. He just thought it was too soon. Now, that was misconstrued into him being a Tory. There was a famous play in a movie that comes out, and that's the complete misrepresentation of who John Dickinson was. Now, that performer is a great performer, or he was. All of those men were, but that was very inaccurate for a lot of them. And although they get the Adams Jefferson thing down a little bit, but they make them in the early 70s kinds of characters, and it's just not the way it was. And Franklin, too. Dickinson was of the belief that, all these great English traditions are ours. Why do we have to break? We're the ones that are committing these offenses. And when you look at them, I mean, you seriously look at the Declaration, you look at the writings before that, you look at English jurisprudence in England, forget America, for the previous 100 years, previous 150 years, you see that that's where the departure is. And, that was part of his concern. It wasn't, he was against it, not at all. If he was against it, he would have stormed out of the room and, at the very least stayed in his manor for the rest of the war. He doesn't do that. He abstains so the Declaration can pass unanimously. So he supports it. In his own way, he supports it. And then he continues to become a militia general in the Pennsylvania and Delaware militias. He ends up leading both provinces and states at different times.
Richard, I got to ask you this. He abstained, but, in today's world, we see politicians literally try and get people to vote. They literally lobby other senators and other congresspeople. Even the president has to lobby at times. Who was doing the most talking? I guess you mentioned Adams. Was he the guy that was rallying everybody to do this, or were there others that were vocal as well?
Yeah, he was really probably the most prominent open voice. Behind the scenes people, I would say, Patrick Henry and Sam Adams, who were probably the most prominent men in that room at that point outside of Franklin. Very quietly were behind the scenes, because at this point, this also speaks to who these men were. These men literally recede into the background. And Jefferson and John Adams take their places, really, in many ways. So they're very much working on this. Richard Henry Lee's another one who works on this. The delegations that they really, are concerned as to, gee, is this the right time? Maryland is one. A couple of people in Delaware, one Delaware individual in particular, but he definitely turns around. Georgia, a little bit, not as much, but South Carolina. Now, South Carolina wants to fight. There's no question about it. And, they have that. North Carolina wants to fight too. So the debate is, this is why we need to do it now. Everybody realized the time was coming. It was inevitable at this point. What else are you going to do? Again, there's nobody to appeal to in England, never mind the UK, specifically in England, which would have been the big one. The populace there was sympathetic, but they hadn't really felt the sting yet. If it had gone on a little bit longer, like it did with Saratoga, I think you would have seen more action from them. But when the French and then the Spanish get in the war, they have to fight them. They can't turn around and say, okay, well, let's help our American brothers here.
Right.
Even though they do eventually. And that's another story for another day. But
that's an interesting point you make, because we do become allies with England at some point. Do you know when that was exactly?
Yeah, I can tell you, probably around 1782, 83 unofficially, when the war's still going on, ironically enough. And that's another story. Because the French and the Spanish courts are really not friendly to a powerful free America. They're there to get back in England. Now, let me preface this. We have individuals who acted differently. You had, Gilbert du Mortier, the Marquis de Lafayette. He definitely was in favor of, and he joins the Continental Army and bleeds at Brandywine, not far from you. You have Pierre de Cotonou, who fights along with John Paul Jones at Flamborough Head, had joined the Continental Navy. He's buried actually in Savannah, Georgia. You had Bernardo de Galvez, who was the governor of Louisiana, who definitely on his own started supporting the American cause before Spain gets in the war. And he has to drag his own generals and admirals along because they're not really enthused in some cases about some of the campaigns, but he does, and he captures the entire Gulf Coast. Admiral Cordoba out of Spain, he captures probably one of the richest hauls in maritime history for goods, gold, silver, and most of that gets turned over to America to help support the war. So we do have contributions they make that are enormously helpful to us. But as far as France and Spain winning the war for us, that's garbage. We probably did more for them than they did for us. They were able to get islands and territory back that they would not have been able to get back on their own if there wasn't an American Revolution.
All right. I
We were
know
the
this.
only ones to capture a British army. Now, French help us in Yorktown, so we
Sure.
have a second capture there. But there are also Hessian soldiers that are fighting in the ranks of the British. So the British aren't fighting along by themselves.
I got to
And there
ask
were
you,
more.
Richard. Mhm.
Hmm?
No, all this history, and I also think of today's world where we're going to see another round of protests on July the 4th. It's like people are not grateful for what the founding fathers did to provide them a country. They're not.
Well, keep in mind, back in the Revolutionary War, 20% of the populace was on the other side. And if we break down the numbers here today, that's similar. And I think you are correct. I think a lot more are. And what we want to do, Alex, because what we want to do to really make this relevant to the time frame here is concentrate on what they did, not on the naysayers today or the naysayers in between or even the naysayers then. We can address them a little bit more and knock that out of the park, so to speak, pardon the parlance. But as far as understanding it, we understand what happened and what they did and why they did it. It negates any argument that's out there. And people are more discovering it. I see it all the time. People, regular folks are coming out to our events and they're saying, gee, we're happy this is here. We brought our kids here. I didn't know this before. I'm appreciating it. My kids are learning this now. That's what we're seeing in great numbers. Um, so as far as I mean, these men pulled off quite, and not just the men in Independence Hall, but in the country. I mean, the whole country came together in great ways. So when it came to the most solemn debate, it was when you were talking to delegates that said, is the timing right? Yeah, the timing's right. Now, they all were in favor of fighting. Understand there have been fighting in English history before, so that wasn't new. Declaring independence was unprecedented. That had not happened yet. So, in any of the colonies that had been set up in the early modern era, that had not happened. You did not have somebody saying, okay, we're on our own. No, that didn't happen. This was new. And so that's where it came to being. And the reason the others came in was because as the war unfolded, they were fighting in New York at that point, which is why New York did not have its instructions. The capital of New York, the assembly couldn't meet in time to give them their instructions. They do, and they finally give them their instructions after the 4th. They get them on the 6th or 7th to sign it, but the New York delegation goes ahead and supports it. But certainly, it ran the gamut from New Englanders were ready to go right away, Virginians, South Carolinians, certainly, Pennsylvanians, some New Yorkers, Marylanders, some North Carolinians were, yeah, we want it, but is this the time to declare independence? Because that's where the debate is. It's not about fighting and it's not about reconciliation yet. It's about, is this the time to do this? Have we exhausted everything? And the answer did it dawn on all of them, obviously, because it was unanimous. Yes. And they went through that process deliberately to make sure that, yep, this is it. And it was it. The most humorous
Yeah.
interchange. And it was well needed because everybody was in a solemn frame of mind at that point. You and I went through there on Independence Day in 22, and we happened to be there at the exact moment that would have been signed. And when you go through the records of the day, they mentioned approving some powder for some of the forces and signed a declaration. It kept it very cryptic because the meeting was in closed doors. They kept it very secret. Now they were solemn, not because they were depressed, far from it, but it was a momentous time for them. And what they had done had been unprecedented. And certainly Providence smiled on them and they believed that. But it was okay. Now we have to bring this forward and we're going to be in for the fight of our lives. And they were. We were. And so apparently and I'm not sure which signing this was because we had different signings. We had signings on the 4th. We had signings on August 2nd. And then we had some signings in November, I believe, that year, between October and November. Elbridge Gerry and Benjamin Harrison. Elbridge Gerry coming out of Massachusetts, Benjamin Harrison coming from Virginia, the famous Harrison family. Elbridge Gerry becomes famous later, vice president, dies in office in the War of 1812 in 1814. Harrison was a very large man. He was 6'2", probably 250 pounds, but he wasn't fat. He was a very healthy man. And Gerry was a very small man, probably not even 5'2" or 130 pounds. And so they happened to be signing together. Harrison turns to Gerry and said, well, Mr. Gerry, should we be hanged for this offense? My pain is going to be a lot quicker than yours because as soon as they drop the noose on me in the floor, he says, my weight and my girth are going to snap my neck immediately. He says, with you and your slighter build, you're going to dangle a little longer. And he just broke out laughing. And the other delegates around them did the same thing. And that was probably the most humorous event of the session.
That sounds fun. And it's amazing that we were there at the time of the actual signing because we had our nice tour guide there, John. I think you might know him from before because I believe you introduced us and whatnot. But I really hope for at least 250 they bring people in to do the reenactment of the signing on the 250th anniversary. It would just make sense, Richard.
I agree with you. I will say that the 250th is certainly being held far more accurately and more proactively than the other, the 225th or the bicentennial had been. But there are things we can improve on. There are certainly things we can improve on to do better. I would pray they do it. A lot of it happens to fall on National Park, but it also falls on Pennsylvania 250 and the other 250s in the other states to say, hey, we'll support this because this should be a group effort, not on one or two organizations by themselves. It should be all 13 states coming together and saying, again, let's put something together. I agree with you. I have not heard anything about that. In fact, other than the parade and the normal ceremonies they do have, I'm not aware of anything happening. I have to believe somebody somewhere is thinking about this, beside you and I.
And we introduced the other idea I had off air, which I think would be the coolest thing on July 9th, 2025. Someone stands in front of Federal Hall because it was in the air, it's in the vicinity of New York City as George Washington reads the letter to the troops like they did in 2026, I should say. So how about that?
We should probably do it on the exact site because I think by that point they were thrown out of New York. Howe drives him out of New York. But it's right near there. It should be on a vicinity. And there's a nice painting done. I think Mort Kunstler, who passed away in January, painted that scene where him reading the Declaration to the troops. I believe it was Mort. My apology. I believe it was.
Because I know Massachusetts. Yes. I saw that. Here's what happens when you get involved with Paul Revere TikTok. You start getting all of Massachusetts history, and I believe they have a whole ceremony where they read the Declaration in Boston as well.
They do. It's not done by us, unfortunately. I did it during the year of COVID because they shut everything down. And one of my friends who was putting together, hey, let's resurrect July 4th, invited me to come up and read it. So I did it there. But what they do is they go to the old State House and you have one of the men from the Ancient and Honorable read it. So And these are men who aren't usually used to reading the Declaration, so some of those words are a challenge to them at times. Um, so, yeah, I don't think that's going to be any different. I think they're going to do the same thing.
Now, mental health hasn't been talked about a lot with these founding fathers because they're strong, they're fervent, they were, I would say alpha, masculine, whatever you want to say. They didn't seem to have the emotions. But do you find in your research a lot of these guys were anxious about declaring? Was there any kind of worry or anxiety about all this?
Oh, sure. I mean, um, they knew they were. See, the problem wasn't so much what they were facing; it's what would happen if they did nothing. There was no, going back would have been 10 times worse than going forward. It would have been worse in America. It would have been worse in England and the rest of Britain. It just would have been worse all the way around. Um,
Because there's like a weight
it
of the
just,
world thing here with this declaring. There's got to be a weight of the world feeling they all had.
yeah. And the reason I also say this is there was a trajectory on freedom, and
Mm-hmm.
this was part of that. And it just developed into the American Revolution, happened to. Certainly, there were reasons why, and it makes sense why I was here. But there was, my God. And then it's like, okay, how, it's going to be up to us now because we're the leaders on this. We have to bring this part of it forward. What do we do to help support the Army? What do we do to help support the Navy? Each one of the states now has its own, um, we'll say it, theater of operations. You have and we'll say Connecticut, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I use him because John Trumbull was probably the best at this of all the governors. And ironically, he's the one governor that stays in power during this whole time from the beginning of the war on through.
Wow.
There's another one for a little while he leaves. But Trumbull organizes his state forces. His home is in Lebanon, Connecticut. In fact, very well preserved. The only
Mm-hmm.
thing they did change is that he had an office that he kept in his house, a
Okay.
separate building. They moved that over. In fact, some friends of mine own a house beyond it. But
Okay.
from that house, he literally led the war effort, not
Mm-hmm.
just for Connecticut, but also helped support the American Revolution in general. That's why Washington referred to him as Brother Jonathan. His son is John Trumbull, the painter, and then Jonathan Trumbull Jr., one of Washington's aides. I mean, it's a very remarkable family. Um, so, where I'm going with this is you had that in all the different states. You had to have men not only go back and, because the states were the ones that were going to feed the Continental Army, Continental Navy, the privateers, um, and they had to do that. And so they had to run their states as well. And of course, they had their families to work with. Their families are going to be largely missing their presence because they were going to be elsewhere.
Mm.
All of these men who signed this declaration had an incident where one degree they had suffered through the war, either
Mm.
participating in it in one way or the other, being captured, which happened in a couple of cases, but they all ended up or having family members,
Mhm.
captured or killed. And none of them made money doing this. They all lost some money one way or the other during the course of this war. Later to build it up for those who survived, but they all ended up really struggling and sacrificing for this. So when you see
Well,
that
I
mass,
understand from one of my previous guests that Richard Battle that apparently they were under threat for declaring. I mean, is it true family members were killed of those that signed the declaration? I heard something like that the king was actually either threatening or actually killing those who were what he would say committing treason or
oh,
however.
certainly right. I mean, there was certainly a sentence hanging over these men. However, it's funny when they or odd when they did capture them, they didn't kill them, and it wasn't because they had a change of heart. It was because understand some of the people fighting here in America. Not all of them were generals or admirals, but some of the forces here were officered by members of parliament. Some of them were lords,
Mm.
and some of them were captured. So we held a number of these men too. We treated them better, to be quite frank about it. We did, but we held them. And anytime there was a reprisal threatened, we said, we have this individual here. You harm this individual, there will be repercussions. So
Wow.
That kind of
Well,
saved them. William Few down in Georgia, his two sons had served in the naval forces, and they were captured. And they were put in Wallabout Bay in New York. For our listeners, that was they were infamous prison ships. And mostly sailors, but some soldiers were held there too. So they approached Few himself and they said, look, if you renounce the Declaration of Independence, we'll free your sons. He basically told them to take a leap. He's not going to do it. Then they approached his sons at some point and they said, look, if you renounce the Declaration of Independence in your father's actions, we'll free you. And they both told him the same thing. So they stayed on board those ships. Unfortunately, they both survived, but they suffered terribly on those ships. So they were not, and he was also told to renounce what they were doing, and they wouldn't do it. I mean, his sons were literally fighting for the liberties that they were putting forward, and they just wouldn't do it. Richard Stockton in New Jersey, he was probably the most famous case. He was probably the one who was tortured the greatest in captivity. Now,
do people
Stockton,
know all of this going into the signing? I feel like it's just a woohoo, we sign, we're free, and now we move on. I feel like you're bringing out something that no one really understands.
yeah, it's not talked about a lot. We talk about it more now, but it's not talked about a lot, Alex. And Richard Stockton was an interesting individual because, he had a son-in-law and a brother-in-law who signed the Declaration with him. Elias Boudinot was his brother-in-law. Benjamin Rush was his son-in-law. And Stockton had been, I believe, up in the Ticonderoga area supporting the troops, and on the way back was captured. Now they knew who they had. And so this capture, because Ticonderoga falls in 77, so he was held for probably 3 years plus. Told to renounce, wouldn't do it. Held under terrible conditions, almost died, needed medical treatment. Washington personally intercedes. Congress certainly does, but Washington personally intercedes and says, we need to get him out of here. We have some of your men. If you do not let him out, well, they very begrudgingly let him out. I think it's maybe 79, 80. He's 80. He's released. His health is broken. And then there were stories that he said or did something that weren't true. They were misconstrued. So even back then, lies were being spread, and they were very soon debunked.
Wow, so fake news is a 249 year plus phenomenon. Well,
lies,
Richard,
subterfuge, and treachery were very rife back then
Richard,
as
the other
well.
thing I want to cover with you, because you and I talk about it as well, is the idea of debate, right? So debating 249 years ago, people are mad now, and I sometimes get ticked at Congress for silly debate, not really. But what's going on with the Big American Beautiful Bill? Both sides are debating the way I feel like it was debated on with the Declaration. And people are like, why are you comparing the two? I say, because this is a crossroads moment like it was 249 years ago. Maybe I'm overreacting here, but it does feel like that.
Well, in a way, it is. I don't know if I wouldn't say the level of debate equals that. And again,
But it is good to see debate alive and well still 249 years later is the point.
From my standpoint, it's in my other life, I am involved in modern politics for certain. Um, but but the thing I will say is when I present this, I try not to make too many modern analogies because people get lost. They know what's going on today, or how should I put it? Even if they're not aware, they're more in. They think they're more aware. They are more familiar with what's happening today, and I don't want them to start drawing false parallels or anything like that. And so, what I'm going to say is, a guy like Stockton, he dies later. He dies before the end of the war. I mean, he dies in 1781. I don't even know if he lives to see Yorktown. I'm forgetting the month now. But I will say this: his sons became very prominent. His daughters obviously married prominent men. His house, Malvern, was in use for many years as the New Jersey governor's mansion, and it's still around today. So he has a legacy. And I mentioned this before too. Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife, who we speak little about. Very interesting woman in her own right, had she lived. She dies in 1782, and the reason she dies is when Benedict Arnold leads his raid on Richmond, which doesn't succeed. They turn north to Monticello, to Charlottesville. And Jefferson just about gets away with his family because he's warned. Jack Jewett rides from Richmond up to Charlottesville and is able to warn them. And he's there with Bannister Tarleton, so he's another ruthless individual. And so they have to hide. And she catches a fever. And there was a lot of rampant fever because of wartime conditions back then, anyhow. And she never recovers. She dies in 1782. That's why he becomes a widower so early, and his daughters don't grow up with a mother. And they paid the price. John Adams sailed on a ship, a naval ship, because he was named minister to. I'm trying to think where he was going at the time. Maybe Holland. And so they had to bring him into Spain. He had to cross the Pyrenees, which is another story. Well, that ship was fired on during the course of. He was in combat, and he took up arms with the Marines. John Quincy Adams was on there with him. Now, whether he picked up anything or not, we don't know. He would have been maybe 11 or 12 at the time. But John Adams took up arms with the Marines. They land in Spain. They have to go by foot over the Pyrenees into France before they go into Holland, or the Dutch Republic at that time. And they both catch fever, and they both almost die there.
Wow.
And
Well,
they do make it.
I have to do more eventually. I have to do research on all these different historical figures because we only sort of know of the ones that are always talked about.
Right.
But to your point about the kids going to parades, that is good to see because we all know in schools the history is being changed a lot. I feel like, and that's
yes.
not good.
Yeah, public schools, yes. Some private too. However, I'm seeing a pushback too. Some in the public, but public schools are, they are government entities now between different factions and interests. But you look at the homeschoolers, people are really starting on their own to teach their kids. Even those who really haven't gotten into homeschooling yet are bringing them to these places. I see them. I mean, ever since I started doing this, the reenacting part of it, in particular, I've seen them just come to more and more of these events, and they enjoy them. That's why I try to avail myself when I can to speak in front of groups like that, pretty much young people who are being taught this, or they're coming to summer camp where they teach these things. But it's decades of research, Alex, on each of these men. Every year I try to perfect more and more what they do and who they were. I mean, I know all of them by this point, and their histories, and I've been to where they lived. In most of their cases, I've been to either where they've lived or where they perform their duties in their states, and which has been a blessing. You have a good feel when you're on the ground and you see exactly where all these things happened.
All right. Well, I want to end this episode about both July 2nd and July 4th with someone that did continue their family's legacy. I mentioned that World War II veterans inspired by founding fathers and World War I veterans, and their families inspired by what they did in World War II, World War I. But I think one of the first historical figures that became president to continue their family's legacy was undoubtedly John Quincy Adams. So he becomes 6th president of the United States. But in my view, it's because what his father did that inspired him to get involved in public service.
Well, John Quincy Adams is a very fascinating man because not only his mother, but his father and his mother too were very influential. Both sides of his family. They had ministers. His uncle on his mother's side was the captain of the Lincoln Minutemen, which is between Lexington and Concord. Becomes a privateer. Doesn't come out of the war very well. He becomes an alcoholic like Quincy's younger brother does. But Quincy Adams had that early beginning. His father's friends, like Joseph Warren, and he was absolutely devastated when the news from Bunker Hill came back that Warren was killed. He claimed that he literally broke down and cried because Warren was his doctor. And he just admired all these men. So I told you the story about him following his father to the Netherlands. Well, he learns how to become a diplomat there. And by the time the war ends, Quincy Adams is probably 16 years old. And just to fast forward so we don't get too far afield, he ends up working for George Washington. And it's under Washington that he becomes the diplomat that he becomes later on. Washington values him so much, he absolutely adores George Washington. He loves both George and Martha Washington immensely. And he he gets caught up in that. His parents do not as much, but they do they get along, but they think there's a lot being, and to a degree there may have been, but
Mhm.
he absolutely is in the Washington is the greatest camp. He names his oldest son George Washington Adams.
Oh, that's so cool. That I did
John
not.
Adams at first wasn't quite sure about that, but of course, he was probably overreacting to. The Adams can be quite, we'll say, um, somewhat conversational in a vigorous way. And so when Adams becomes president, both of them decide this is improper. I can't stay as a diplomat. I can't be the president and have you be the diplomat. So Washington gets a hold of this. He finally hears what they're talking about. Now he knows the Adams very well by now. He calls both of them in separately. He calls John Adams in first, I think, and he says to him, maybe first, I don't know, but he talks to him and he says, your son is the most valuable diplomat I have. He's going to be of immense value to you. You have to keep him. Then he calls Quincy in. I think he
Mhm.
brings him in second. And he says, your father's going to need a lot of help. You are the best diplomat we have over there. You need to stay in that post. All this talk of nepotism, he says to both of them, is ridiculous. Well, they heeded his advice, and Adams stayed on, and he stayed in the diplomatic post right up through the War of 1812.
When then he becomes Secretary of State. By the way, we're 250 years old. By 249 years old, I should say. By 1817, we've already had 8 United States Secretary of States. That's amazing to me. By
Yes.
1817, there was 8 Secretary of States, and I'm guessing about 2 or 3 presidents in that time, because he becomes president in 1825. So,
Yes, he's inaugurated in 1825. Now, interestingly enough, um, even though he had been a Federalist, he had kind of left that genre, particularly when the Federalist Party starts to change a bit. And he works very closely with Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson is absolutely thrilled when he's running for president, by the way. And John Adams writes to him and he says, you would think he was your son because he was the policies and such. I mean, John Quincy is probably the one that had the best viewpoint, eyewitness to many people in American history that created the country, not just before him, but after him. He was actually one of the prototypes for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was one of his people he mentored. Henry Clay, even Calhoun to a degree. They all respected him, even if they didn't agree with him. But Lincoln certainly was one of his proteges. So yeah, that's with Adams. Um, what was your other question? I'm sorry.
well, no, mainly the fact that they had 8 Secretary of States up until that point. That's pretty
Yeah, they
remarkable.
did. They did. There was some turnover. So eventually, when you look at all those signers, they
Yeah.
all contributed something. Not all of the signers were present when the Declaration was voted on either. Um,
Which
some of
is
the
important to note
signatures,
because I did not know that until you mentioned that to me the other day, actually.
well, the most prominent one was Robert Livingston. He is not there. He's there as the Committee of Five with Adams and Jefferson and Franklin and Roger Sherman. He leaves, and again, that speaks to the moment you asked me what was the sense like. Well, these men had to, attain other business when they could do it, and that meant in many of their cases to leave that day, and or even the day before. Oh, no, yeah, that day. We'll say that day. So they may not have been around to stick around to sign that first signing. Um, and he was one of them. But his brother gets elected in his stead, Edward, and he signs it. He signs the Declaration, which is ironic.
By the way, speaking of all the signing, you mentioned to me the other day when we did our pre-show chat, the parade started right away on July 4th, 1776. That's correct, right?
They had a gathering of people outside of Philadelphia to read it. Yeah.
Amazing.
I don't know if you would call it a parade, but it was a huge gathering, and that was the first reading they did. And I think they did one a couple of days after, if I'm not mistaken. But they were doing parades right away. I mean, they were doing the 4th of July commemorations, celebrations right away. I mean, they did, of course, because on the 4th, by the time even people in Philadelphia knew it was already over. But for 77, they were celebrating the 4th as the day.
That is just so cool. All right. From your expertise as, with your political involvement and then as your reenactment and as your love of America and American history, how do we go to get it to 250 and beyond? I think that's the next goal, is to get us, because I still look at us as a very fairly young country. 249 years old is young,
yeah.
Right? So how do we keep us going to 300 and then 350 and then, the like?
Well, for us, what I'd like to see us do, those of us who are, privileged enough, blessed enough to be able to commemorate in some meaningful way those moments from 250 ago, to do it in a way that it stays with young people. I remember in the bicentennial, I was very impressed the fact we were doing something. I can't say that everybody I saw was impressive. They really weren't. But what we want to do is, in the best detail we can, highlight exactly what's going on. Keep in mind, for battlefield commemorations, the 250th goes on till 2031. The war itself continues on till, or the 250th really continues on to 2033, because you have a 2-year interval when the war winds down. Nobody knew at Yorktown it was going to end at Yorktown, but they knew that, the writing was on the wall, so to speak. Things were moving in a direction that was, probably not likely to be altered. However, nobody knew that, okay, well, the war is over now, it's just a matter of time. Well, they didn't know it at that point. So it was another 2 years. The British don't evacuate Boston until November, but that's after the war's over. They're not doing much in there. They're just there because they agreed to let them just collect their forces and then pull out at a certain time. But it actually ends April 19th, 1783. They picked that day to commemorate the end of the war. The preliminary peace was signed, I want to say, probably in the fall of 1782. And then the ratifications take place in March and April on both sides of the Atlantic.
Very interesting breakdown of all of this. And Richard, as we go along, I'd love to have you on for more conversation about this. I always say that, but I mean it as we gear toward 250. I'd love to have you on in the lead up to all this, because you just got a wealth of knowledge and a love of country that I think needs to be talked about and heard on this podcast.
No, I'd love to. I love appearing on here. I think it's a great venue.
And I got to catch up with you at some point in person. That would be awesome.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to do that too.
That would be great. All right, Richard Howell. And where can people find you if they do want you to do a reenactment for them or be part of their troupe?
Well, they can find me on social media. I have a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page. My Facebook page is in my name. I put RJ on there to differentiate me from the other Rich Howells you may run into. There are a few of us out there. On LinkedIn, it's historical lectures, research, and reenactments. But my name is there too. And obviously, you have my contact information. If anybody wanted to reach out to you directly and say, gee, how do I get a hold of him if they want to, feel free to pass it on.
Absolutely. Well, happy Independence Day. And thanks for, doing your part. I've said this time and time again, reenactors are so vital in keeping history going. So thank you for doing that as well.
It's my pleasure, Alex. And, thank you for helping to spread the word on all this too. And
Hey,
happy
you know what?
Independence.
Preserving history is how we're going to have one leg up for the country. That's what it is.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. But yes, especially this history, yes. And happy Independence Day to you as well.
Thank you so much. That was Richard Howell on the One Leg Up Network.